Good. Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for the invitation to be part of this conference. It's been a very enlightening, if I may use that term, experience for me. I'm also very grateful to, if I may use a theological concept here, this looks like the faithful remnant that has gathered this morning. During the course of a number of the papers and discussions, Immanuel Kant has hovered in the background, and we might perhaps consider what I'm doing today as this is the seance in which we call up the spirit of Immanuel Kant, or at least in one of the forms which I think bears some resemblance to his own thinking. Let me start with a summary of what I'm trying to do, and then as I go through the various parts of my presentation, I'll reference it to the material that I have on the PowerPoint. To some extent, my presentation is actually a kind of recounting of how I changed my mind about Kant's relationship to the framework of just war thinking. And then I think it does have some bearings on this question of what does it mean to win a war. Okay. In the various texts in which Immanuel Kant discusses the principles that should govern relations among nations, including those texts that explicitly deal with the sources that lead states to engage one another in armed conflict and the circumstances that enable the cessation of that conflict, he does not directly engage the question what constitutes victory in war. This should not be all that surprising, given what I consider to be the mordant irony that pervades much of Kant's treatment of war and the principles, and I put that term in scare quotes, by which moralizing politicians, that's translation of Kant's term, justify the use of force as an instrument of policy in an international order that they view as Hobbes' state of nature writ large. Now, Kant is not claiming that, what he calls moralizing politicians, have theorized about the international order as a state of nature. It's just that in practice, that in fact is what they affirm. The substance and the tone of Kant's dismissal of the realpolitik that guides moralizing politicians indicate that the key dynamic in his thinking about war arises from his account of the principles of human moral self-governance, that is, autonomy, that are operative in the practical, i.e. the moral use of reason. Kant will thus argue that a cosmopolitan perspective, which the practical, moral exercise of our reason enables us to take upon the role of human moral action in history, provides the basis from which we may justifiably hope in the effectiveness of the efforts we take to establish conditions for lasting peace. In consequence, it thus becomes possible to offer a Kantian answer to the question, what constitutes victory in war, by framing it in reference to this cosmopolitan hope for the establishment of an international order for securing enduring peace. So that's the basic framework of what I'm trying to do. What I would add to that is that the conclusion that I've come to is that Kant, in the end, morally deconstructs both the notion of war and the notion of victory in war. It isn't that he's denying those terms are used, he's not denying the reality of conflict, but from the perspective of the practical use of reason, particularly the practical use of reason as it is exhibited in what he calls a cosmopolitan perspective. In effect, there's no place for war, and a fortiori, there's no place for victory in war. and what we should be, morally engaged in is the kind of activities which create the both the institutional and the moral conditions under which perpetual peace is possible. And so that's basically the way I'm going on this, on this, my presentation. So, okay, now, so when I got the invitation to participate in this conference, one of my immediate reactions was, this is a very interesting question, because it's a question that I, at least in the kind of discussions I've engaged about with regard to war and peace, be it in terms of the Catholic theology's engagement with just war thinking or with Kant's thinking, it seems like that question doesn't really come up in a specific, articulated directly and clearly. So I said, okay, interesting question. What does Kant have to say to it? Well, he doesn't raise the question. And I thought, well, let me see if I can construct an answer, a plausible answer on the basis of Kant's text. And, again, just for the sake of, and the text in which that are relevant for his engagement with this question run for, and these are the published works, run for more than a decade. And so some of his essays, the 1784 essay on an idea for universal history, there's a 1793 essay on theory and practice, which is very, very interesting. It's not, it's not one of those texts that kind of comes to the top in terms of people's reading of Kant, but it's particularly from moral questions of the intersection of morality and politics. It's very interesting. His text, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, has some, I think, particularly interesting connections to the essay on perpetual peace. They're written roughly within a similar time frame. And then some very important texts are in the Metaphysics of Morals, Part 1, particularly towards the end. And then he has another essay that was published in 1798 in a collection of 3 essays that got published under the title Conflict of the Faculties. Okay. So as I was trying to engage this question, one of the things I realized was that in some of the other things that I have presented on Kant's thinking about war and peace, I have taken it for granted that Kant can be located more or less within the tradition of just war thinking. The text I will show on the PowerPoint are texts which certainly indicate that Kant was aware of the structure, the formal structure of just war thinking. Secondly, it also indicates that Kant was attentive to what in recent discussion has been called jus post bellum. He actually offers some considerations with that regard. But looking both more closely at those texts, and what was particularly important for me was looking again at a paper by the Dutch scholar Thomas Mertens, who was a participant in a conference I took with me in a conference. Asa was also there at the Institute for Theology and Peace in Hamburg. Thomas has a very good paper in which he, I think, makes at least a plausible and, to me, convincing argument that whatever Kant is doing, it's not just war theory. Okay, so anyway. So here are some of the texts in which, as I said, give a clear indication that, Kant is aware of ad bellum, in bello, and he has some sense of that tradition. Okay, jus ad bellum. Okay, the right of nations to go to war and carry on hostilities is a legitimate way by which they prosecute their rights and by their own power when they regard themselves to be injured. In fact, and this really should be a clue that something else is going on rather than simply just war theory, in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant says the only right of nations in the international, in international relations is the right to go to war. That's it, flat out, nothing else. Okay, jus in bello, okay, again, Metaphysics of Morals. Now, and this is a very interesting comment. The determination of what constitutes right in war is the most difficult problem of the right of nations and international law. And then, jus post bellum, right which follows after war begins at the moment of the Treaty of Peace and refers to the consequences of that war. Okay, so then I went back to these texts and I said, does Kant's do his references to the formal structure of just war in these texts indicate a commitment to that view? Okay, and then if it does, then does he also provide any new insight or useful perspective, at least for the just war tradition, on the question of what does it mean to win a war? Now, the answer I finally came to is no. If he's a just war thinker, he doesn't help. Okay, prodded by Thomas Merton's essay, what I then decided to do is let me go back and look at some things and see, well, if Kant is not a just war, theorist or a just war, or, proponent of that in some modified form or another, well, what in fact is he doing? Okay, so, and I'll put up the text. I'll give away my conclusion, which is the texts seem to suggest that Kant is much closer to Hobbes than anything else. Okay, so as and this is just simply a kind of a listing of text which, in my view, indicate that Kant has a pretty dour, grim view of the normal state of international relations. Okay, so
understandable, wouldn't you think?
Well, yeah. Okay, so states, views, and nations in their external relations to one another, like lawless savages, are naturally in a non-juridical condition. Okay, and this other little excerpt again from the Metaphysics of Morals, I think is telling, particularly the clause which I've emphasized. Yet the condition is wrong in itself in the highest degree, and the nations which form states contiguous to each other are bound mutually to pass out of it. Okay, now the bound mutually to pass out of it, of course, is, I think, a crucial point, and yet it's a point in which Kant himself leaves undetermined, at least in concrete forms, what the agency by which that moving out of that state is affected. Okay. All right. So again, okay. Then again, those of you who are familiar with perpetual peace should see the same structure of argument in this next excerpt, which he in effect provides a kind of shorthand argument that the modality by which a different international order is to be established is through what he calls in this case, a permanent Congress of Nations. Now, again, what I've emphasized here is a point which I think isn't highlighted sufficiently in much of the discussions of, for instance, whether Kant was arguing for some kind of confederation, some kind of League of Nations, or whether he was arguing for a world state, because I think what gets missed, and again, Kant himself doesn't, as in many of his arguments, the proof of this is left to the reader. He has these allusions to forms of civil processes that adjudicate disputes. And it seems to me that may be the more important kind of mechanism for bringing about the kind of cosmopolitanism that Kant advocates, rather than the political structure, international political structure of confederation or world state. Even though one of the things he leaves unsettled is what's the relationship between those two. Because if it does turn out that the political arrangements are necessary for having the appropriate adjudicatory mechanisms, this is simply a consequence of those political arrangements rather than something that either causally or conceptually can be detached from them. Okay, but anyway, so okay, then in this particular passage from the Metaphysics of Morals is one I'm very fond of quoting in various contexts, because not only does it make clear, you might say, the fundamental, the way in which Kant thinks questions of peace and war are very, very fundamental for the shape of human moral life. It happens to be one of the places in which Kant, at least by implication, concretely identifies a specific categorical imperative. There shall be no war. And there's a way in which our human moral agency, both individually and however it may function collectively, is under some obligation to bring that about. As I said, it's a but again, he says that this is not the way by which anyone should prosecute his right, namely means of violent conflict, war. Okay, so. Then, just a few more things to darken the mood of Kant's view of human nature. Okay, human nature appears nowhere less amiable than in the relation of whole nations to each other. No state is for a moment secure against another in its independence or its possessions. The will to subdue each other or to reduce their power is always rampant, and the equipment for defense, which often makes peace even more oppressive and more destructive of internal prosperity of war, can never be relaxed. Okay, so again, again, one more. This one was from Perpetual Peace. So anyway, so if they're kind of going back to these texts, having been convinced by Thomas Merton's argument that I at least have to go back and look at the text, I found myself in a situation, asking the question, okay, does this clearly gloomy assessment of human rivalry and hostility show that in these texts that align Kant with Hobbes, simply, with the result that victory in war simply means the inevitably temporary cessation of combat, ensuing upon the military and political capitulation of one side to another. Okay? Victory of any kind is transient. Okay? Victory of any...
A truce.
Huh?
A truce.
Truce, yeah. Even if it's called a victory, even if there's a period of relative, tranquility after the cessation of hostilities. I mean, it looks like a view that says, at some point, war is going to break out again. The kinds of interests that are in play are such that war in some case has an inevitability to it. The other point I'd like to make here is that it seems to me that an account of Kant's understanding of a concept of victory, or the moral intelligibility of talking about victory in war, it's deeply tied up with his understanding of the workings of history. So if you look at Kant's account, if you will, as simply something that might be, you might say, the political theory that's embedded in it might be detached from his account of history, I think you're going to end up, you may find some useful things in it, but what you're going to draw out of it is considerably less Kant's account than, it's kind of like, mining, for some kind of precious metals, and picking up a few pieces here and there and putting them to your own purpose, rather than in fact kind of somehow or other getting a sense of the whole fabric, if I may switch my metaphors here, the whole fabric of Kant's thinking and Kant's argument. Okay. So what lies between a just war account, or aligning Kant simply in terms of one of the various kinds of thinkers who saw usefulness in just war theory, and lining him up with a kind of Hobbesian picture of war and the possibilities for bringing war to some kind of victorious conclusion. Okay. Going back to the text, one of the things again, this is a question I never had previously formulated for myself. I mean, it actually ends up being a couple of questions, at least a couple of questions, is that in Kant's Perpetual Peace essay, he offers two sets of articles for perpetual peace. He offers a set of preliminary articles, 6 of them, and then he offers what he calls the 3 definitive articles for And I started to ask myself the question, okay, what's the difference between the first set of articles and the second set of articles? And then secondly, does Kant give an account of how you move from the first set of articles to the second set of articles? Okay. So first, what I think can be said about the preliminary articles. They seem to be articles that address themselves to the baseline condition of international lawlessness without necessarily presuming that that condition is going to change. However, he does seem to suggest, but he doesn't argue for, the view that accepting these 6 preliminary articles will then at least provide the conditions for moving forward to the kinds of things that will then bring about a change in the baseline condition of international lawlessness. Okay. Let me just, okay. So, and one of the indications of this for me in looking at the text is that one of the things the preliminary articles do is they continue to recognize the decisive operative weight that even with their adoption, pragmatic and prudential considerations of national interest will continue to play in the international state of nature. As he puts out for most of these, the relatively brief case he does for why these would function as appropriate preliminary articles for perpetual peace, the kinds of reasons he gives, or the kinds of reason he articulates for why nations would agree to this are primarily prudential reasons that have to do with self-interest. There are moral considerations, but he does seem to at least as on my reading of the arguments he gives there, he wants the, you might say, the argument for these to be an argument which somebody who is looking at these things even from the perspective of what he calls a moralizing politician might say, oh yeah, there's reason for doing that. Okay, and again, so these are the preliminary articles, just so. For those of you, for those of you who have not memorized them, here are, no reservations in the Treaty of Peace with regard to, continuing the war. A question here that has to do with both territoriality and preserving of sovereignty. The third one is the third. And the fourth ones are ones that do have a very interesting bite to them. And the reasons that Kant adduces for them are, again, partially prudential. They edge towards what he would consider to be properly moral considerations. But again, these two preliminary articles are embedded within Kant's a kind of a larger argument that Kant has about the way in which the economic consequences of war would have the effect of moving the populace to somehow or other, urge their representatives to say, this is costing too much, couldn't we spend the money for better things, kind of argument. Okay. And then I like this one, such as the employment of assassins, poisoner, breach of capitulation. I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. An incitement to treason in the opposing state. I think in one version of this, he also has something. The way he describes assassins, seems more like snipers. Yeah. Okay. Oh, anyway. Okay. So now. But anyway, my conclusion, in trying to work through those articles is that, with respect to even, and he actually has this comment in the second definitive article piece. The concept of law of nations as a right to make war does not really mean anything, and then adds. The only conceivable meaning of such a law of nations might be that it serves men right, who are so inclined that they should destroy each other and thus find perpetual peace in the vast grave that swallows both atrocities and their perpetuators. Now, again, that itself is an allusion to the very opening of the Perpetual Peace essay, in which the notion of perpetual peace or eternal peace is a reference to the name of a tavern in which what we would call the logo for the tavern is a graveyard. I know, which makes sense. Frieden is eternity. It's actually I'm sure there's some allusion there to the the benediction or the prayer, the Trinitarian prayer that ends, world without end, or give people perpetual peace. So anyway, all right, now. So the three definitive articles for perpetual peace propose a structural framework of national and international governance to be a catalyst for transforming the lawless international state of nature into a cosmopolitan world order. I mean, another way of putting this is, I think the preliminary articles help mitigate the symptoms. The preliminary articles are, in one sense, supposed to, somehow or other cure the disease. Okay. The consequence that this has, if I'm right, is that because there are no wars in such an order, victory ceases to be a functioning concept in the discourse of international relations. And again, here are the three definitive articles. And you'll notice that, again, the matter over which they govern is different from the matter over which the three preliminary articles govern. Okay? So civil constitution, every state should be republican, the law of nature should be founded on a federation of free states, and the law of world citizenship should be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. Now, they all have their, both in very intriguing, important points, they all have their difficulties, but what I would argue for is that underlying the definitive articles is the cosmopolitan standpoint that the moral use of our human reason enables us to take upon ourselves the responsibility of giving shape to the trajectory of humanity's moral vocation in history, which is to bring about an order of perpetual peace. Now, just a couple of things in conclusion with regard to this other question of, well, what's the relationship between the two? Okay, and again, this is, you might say, this is my, how I try to make what Kant is doing fairly plausible, or at least plausible in some sense. It does seem to me that at one level, the perpetual peace essay is addressed, of course, in Kant's Enlightenment view, it's addressed to the learned public, but an implicit and I think probably intended audience for Kant were the sovereigns of Europe. Because on Kant's account of political governance, the sovereigns are the agents of bringing this about. So I would actually read the perpetual peace essay as in effect, a call for the sovereigns of Europe to undergo a moral conversion. Because, and the reason for that is the dilemma that Kant, I think, knows he has set up with regard to what is the agency that can bring about an exit from the international state of nature, which is different from, he makes it clear that in terms of his version or his using of the contract image, and he does claim that it is moral, indeed it is an obligation to compel individuals to leave the state of nature, to come into the civil order of a individual, a specific political community. Coercion is needed. I think he's fairly consistent with regard to the question of this entrance into a new international political order cannot be coerced. It's got to issue from an exercise of freedom. Now, for Kant, in one sense, that freedom or the agency, the agent who has that freedom, is much less complicated because he thinks it resides in the sovereign, who can make this decision, in the name of the nation. Okay? I think it gets more complicated when remember, Kant was, in his political theory, he wants a republican constitution. He doesn't want a democratic constitution, at least democratic in the sense of majoritarian rule. Okay, he's on the same side of Plato as Plato with regard to that. So again, I think, and again, for me, one of the major kind of issues that Kant's account raises, I think, as a continuing kind of problem, among others, a continuing challenge, is this whole question of the agency of nation states, and who is responsible for that agent, who is the agent, and in what sense can the agency of a nation state function in a way that it in Kant's sense of the word, it is autonomous, not in the sense of simply pursuing its own self-interest, but holding itself bound to universal moral rules. So again, I think the lessons here are both positive and negative, and I'm glad that the shade of Kant hovers around us as we discuss these kinds of things. Thank you.